Hello, everyone. Welcome back to another Security Shorts with Scott. This one's going to be a fascinating one. It's a topic that almost everybody cares about, and a lot of people sort of want to know the gory details. And so we've brought an expert on and a good friend of mine, Shane Shook. Welcome to the podcast.
Hi.
So for everyone who doesn't know, Shane is an expert in incident response and forensics and a partner with Forgepoint Capital, the leading cybersecurity VC in the world. So Shane, welcome to the podcast, and maybe start with real quick. I know your background in the military and what have you, but maybe a quick 30 seconds on sort of how did you get into incident response and forensics analysis and all these other things?
Yeah, it's kind of a long path over the last almost 40 years of my career, but the first 10 years I was trained up and flew missions for the Air Force as a reconnaissance operator. So I was on the, if you will, the red team side of things. Then coming out of this service around Y2K a few years before, I spent a lot of time focused on resiliency, on systems and availability, planning and execution on software through operating system, through application stacks. And then in the early 2000s, security, privacy, and governance became hot topics in the IT space. At the time, I was with Big Four consulting firms and really specialized in the what I called at the time SPC, but it's since become cybersecurity, focused on the CIA triad. Then sort of mid 2000s, around 2007, 8, there was an enormous focus of the industry on cybersecurity as we know it today, with particular focus on identity, application, and kernel management of applications. I got into analyzing incidents sort of as a referral from other work I've been doing as an expert witness in capital markets, technical infrastructure, dealing with allegations of market manipulation, pump and dump, front running, and other things that involved a huge amount of data, but also software and systems analytics to assess whether there was accuracy to the claims. And that all served well when it came to the breaches that were starting to come into focus around sort of 2008, 2009. And working with the Foundstone team, brought me to McAfee. Coincidentally, working, at arm's length with, folks like you at Symantec and FireEye. It's a small community, and over time, found myself doing, after having done probably 10 to 15 years of principal incident response for victim companies and organizations. I found myself being asked more and more often by regulators and insurance carriers to do, and boards of directors to do second review. So lately, aside from a handful of pet clients that still choose to call me at midnight when things happen, aside from them, I'm mostly these days focused on second review to assess the sort of the quality of delivery and findings of other principal incident responders.
That makes sense. Long storied history in the space. So let's get into the specifics. So listen, breaches, because of Hollywood or whatever the reason, sometimes come across as sexy and interesting to people out there. But I think there's a real misconception because I think, folks for the most part think about, the guy in the hoodie and launching some malware into some organization. And that's not really what we're seeing today. So why don't you take, again, for the layman out there, so assume that this person doesn't really know much about breaches, what's really happening and how is it that organizations continually get breached in today's world?
Yeah, fundamentally, it's imposters. So people appealing to your social network to gain access, to then steal your sort of your identity, your profile more than anything, to then either commit help desk fraud by calling in to help them attain what we call business email compromise to steal money, by appealing to the help desk as an executive of the company, or social engineering through email or chat applications or something to gain access, using often the same support tools that IT uses, like LogMeIn, other types of remote access. It's a much more direct entry than the old uh, breaking and entering that the hackers used to do. It's so much easier to social engineer your way in, and that's for the past probably 6 years, particularly through the pandemic, where most people were working and being supported remotely from home. It's largely been identity-based attacks.
And we're going to get into the identity-based attacks because I want to talk a little bit about how that's relevant for a lot of companies. But I know when I talk to organizations and they say, "Oh, identity-based attacks," then we're probably not really going to be a target because why would we be? They would have to spend a lot of time backwards engineering our identities. So how do you respond to organizations that don't think they're really a target because quote unquote it's a lot of work to get somebody's identity?
Yeah, it's really not. We're all so interconnected due to two phenomena. One is the fact that I don't think you could go anywhere in the world and not find somebody carrying one of these. And this is a computing device that has your identities for your various applications, personal and corporate, that translate across the entire stack in your personal life and your corporate life. And we're so interconnected. My connection with you, your connection with your clients, it's something that is specifically targeted as a means of social engineering access to those objective targets. So, another phenomenon of the past few years is what we call APT, Advanced Persistent Threat Actors. More commonly today, will target a tertiary identity than a primary identity. In other words, they'll target someone like me to gain access via you to one of your supported customers rather than going directly to one of your customers. It's much easier to hide in all the noise, or what we call the weeds, through those varied activities, and it's less likely that someone can connect those dots to identify the origin.
So one of the things that comes up quite a bit, so we've made this transition for a lot of organizations anyways, from AV, antivirus, to EDR. So a lot of companies are like, hey, I've upgraded to EDR. Um, that's good, right? Like, it's really good at detecting malicious code on my machine. Um, and for better or for worse, maybe that's even supported by the industry, by folks like us. We try not to. How do you respond to people that say, "Hey, I've upgraded to the best in class endpoint technology, endpoint detection and response capabilities"? That's good. What would you say to that?
Well, it's first of all, it's great that they've made that transition from antivirus to EDR. It's still a transition in progress, even after 13 years. And you and I have both been along for the ride in that transition, having come, in your case, from Symantec, and mine, McAfee, and working with FireEye and CrowdStrike, and in my case, Cylance and SentinelOne and others. Um, so we've seen that, but I mean, you really hit an important point. EDR is designed fundamentally to address the code um, attacks on an endpoint, and that's its limiting factor. Uh, so the old concept of an endpoint was a computer, which is fundamentally still a laptop or a server or a desktop computer. Um, More and more of the computers that we actually rely on, though, are mobile, either as iPads, Chromebooks, mobile phones, and a variety of other devices that have, unfortunately, all these application interfaces. I mean, even to your Apple Watch, as an example. And so really today, the endpoint to really try to protect is identity. It's an abstract concept, but we recognized probably 10 years ago that the network was a new endpoint. And so there've been a lot of focus on CASB and firewall and IDS and things to address the risks of exploitation of that endpoint. Um, we've only seen the growth of the recognition of identity as an endpoint over the past couple of years. And so it's still very nascent. And as such, these platforms don't yet do a good job of protecting that endpoint. So, user behavior analytics is a byproduct of the endpoint that the EDR are capable of assessing, but then it transitions into a concept called MDR that you're very aware of. And managed detection and response, unfortunately, is a passive defense. It's not an active defense. And it means that you have to wait for something to happen to develop a pattern that is sufficient to generate an alert that demands an investigation. And so we're still on the early stages of the evolution of identity as an endpoint for protection.
Hmm. Yeah, it's funny because in we don't plug Soul Cyber on these, but when we built Soul Cyber, we started with the concept that identity first was going to be the way to focus on threats for the next, foreseeable future. And so far, we think that's been pretty prescient. But I know that a lot of customers struggle with that idea around identity first detection. And so when we talk about identity first, why does that matter so much? If you think about somebody getting a hold of let's just say there's a little bit of a failure inside of the management of the underlying infrastructure, right? Maybe MFA got forgotten on some machines or on an identity. Maybe there's a 0 day. Maybe there's a vulnerability that's hard to patch. So now all of a sudden somebody's in the network, or nefarious actors in the network. What do they do? So they've gotten in some way. It's not that hard. We all know that. So what do they do, and how do they not? If you're just sitting there with EDR, how do they not trip something? How do they do so much damage?
Yeah, so there's effectively three objectives that cyber attackers have, that I generally refer to, and that's subvert controls in order to take control of an environment. And that's exhibited through the past 20 years of backdoor Trojans and botnets. It allows attackers to utilize their own access to subvert the controls of the environment, and so that then they can either themselves achieve whatever their secondary objectives are, stealing data, stealing money, or causing interruption, or they can sell that access on, as we often see through initial access brokers, to other people that have those objectives, that probably have more sophisticated understanding of the business processes in the sector that's targeted. So aside from subversion, the second is sabotage, and we saw that mainly in sort of the mid early 2000s with DDoS attacks, and then those moving on to wiper attacks in banks, and more recently ransomware, where ransomware was the objective, as opposed to today where ransomware is an effect, a secondary outcome. And then the third is stealing, whether it be money or information that has first or second order impact on the organization. The point is that, taking this as an example again, nearly everyone uses, for corporate purposes, O365 or G Suite. And my O365 account on this device is the same one that I use in the cloud through a browser, as on my laptop, as on a desktop. And so even if it's MFA protected, there's still vulnerabilities like SMS, smishing as we hear, where we can do a force smish that basically you just exhaust the user. So they unfortunately click the MFA authorization, which provides that third-party access through that cloud account out to all of those devices that are trusted by that account. So then they can conduct one of those three objective outcomes of
But Shane,
subverting.
if they're locking up, if they're ransomwaring organization companies and devices and they're stealing data, don't they have to drop some malicious code onto a machine that would be detected by the EDR?
No, not at all. And actually,
So how do they
they're
do that? Because I hear this
yeah.
all the time, like, well, even if they get in, eventually when they go to ransom us, they're going to drop some malicious code and we're going to detect it there.
So that's a nuance. They will drop some malicious code, but it's more likely that they'll either create it in your environment longhand
Hmm.
with the tools that already exist
Yeah,
for your IT support, or they'll have previously created it and just import it. But these are not going to be malicious binaries like we saw with
that's right.
viruses.
I think that's the key
Rather,
piece, right? You say
you
it all the
just
time, which is a script. If somebody writes a script and they're in your organization, that's not
yeah.
necessarily malicious code, right?
Right, absolutely. Whether it's a JavaScript on a browser or a C sharp script with utility on every endpoint, every Windows endpoint, a Bash script on a Linux or a Mac, um, it really doesn't matter. Those tools exist in the environment.
So, what do you think going forward? What do you think organizations need to think about? Call it over the next 1 to 3 years. Where do they need to sort of have their mind when they're thinking about just good solid security?
So two things. First, they need to recognize that there are different endpoints. So we've talked about the computer as an endpoint. We've talked about the network as a recognized endpoint. And we've talked about identity as an endpoint. And so first, to have security posture, you've got to have observability. And unfortunately, particularly in the mid market, but often even at the larger enterprise, they rely too much on EDR, which only addresses that computing endpoint, and not enough on network and identity, or cloud, which is another type of endpoint, observability, so that at least they have a passive detect and response capability to eventually get to a more proactive capability. Until you've got a full stack observability for passive detect and response, you really can't plan for the vertical uh, uh, protection needs for active defenses to make effective use of MFA or to make effective use of data redundancy and that sort of thing.
Makes sense. So quality visibility with the ability to do obviously, some level of advanced detection based on identity is the starting
Yeah,
point because then
it
you can
really
start going to specifics.
Yeah, it really demands on making the shift from EDR to MDR, or this new concept of XDR, where the detect and response focuses on the full stack based on what we see are the attack patterns and the vectors that enable the objective outcomes.
Awesome. Awesome. Awesome, Shane. Well, listen, I appreciate the level of detail. Is there anything else that you think is top of mind on your side that you want to share with the audience?
I mean, MFA is your friend. It's shocking.
Yep.
It's been around for so long, and yet fewer than 20% of applications that can be equipped with it are actually equipped.
Hmm.
And that's empirical from at least the work I've done, but also industry
It's
references.
it's the number one thing when I get asked what is the one thing, and there is no one thing. There's no silver bullet, but I'm like, turn your MFA on, right, and try to make sure it's comprehensive.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Awesome. Shane, thank you very much for joining Security Shorts. To everyone out there, as always, we appreciate the sponsorship. Thanks for joining us. As always, you know where to find us, Scott at soulcyber.com. And with that, everybody have a great rest of your week. Thanks for joining, and we'll talk with you again soon. Thanks.